The haunting on Route 69. Joe Mathers had been a trucker for over 20 years, and there wasn't much on the road that could shake him. He'd driven through blizzards, tornadoes, and down dark, winding roads in the dead of night. But nothing ever felt quite like Route 69, a stretch of highway deep in the Midwest that had earned a reputation for being one of the most unsettling routes around. Some truckers said it was cursed, while others swore they'd seen things on that road that defied reason. It was just before midnight when Joe pulled into the truck stop at the start of Route 69. He'd been running low on sleep, but he had a load of frozen meat that needed to be delivered by morning. The dispatcher had made it clear, no delays. So, after grabbing a cup of black coffee and giving his truck a once-over, Joe climbed back into the cab, turned on his radio, and rolled out onto the infamous Route 69. For the first few miles, everything was routine. The road stretched endlessly in front of him, illuminated only by the dim glow of his headlights. Joe flipped through radio stations, settling on a classic rock playlist to keep him company. There were no other cars in sight, just him, the empty road, and an eerie mist that seemed to rise up from nowhere, hovering around his truck like a shroud that he shrugged it off. "Just fog," he muttered, taking a sip of coffee. But then, the radio began to static out. The music warped, slowed, and finally cut to silence. Joe tried fiddling with the dial, but nothing came back. Frustrated, he gave up and focused on the road, figuring the reception was just lousy on this stretch of highway. That's when he saw it. A shape up ahead, standing in the middle of the road. Joe squinted, trying to make out what it was. At first, he thought it might be an animal, but as he got closer, he realized it was a person. A woman, standing alone in the middle of the road, her head bowed, long black hair hanging down like a curtain. Her clothes were soaked, clinging to her skin as if she'd been walking in the rain. Though the night was dry, Joe slowed the truck, rolling to a stop a few yards away. He leaned out the window and called, "Hey, you okay?" The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, completely still. Something about her made his skin crawl. She was too thin, her limbs unnaturally long, almost as if she were stretched out. Joe swallowed, the hair on the back of his neck prickling. He knew he should help her. After all, it wasn't right to leave someone stranded on the side of the road at night, but something deep down screamed at him to stay in the truck. "Lady, you need a ride or something?" he asked again, his voice sounding small and shaky in the night. Slowly, the woman lifted her head. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and hollow, filled with something Joe couldn't quite name but felt in his bones. Fear. Pure, primal fear. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rumble of his truck. "Don't go any further." Joe's heart thudded in his chest. "What are you talking about?" "Turn back," she whispered, her voice like the hiss of the wind. "Before it finds you." A chill ran down his spine, and he clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Something in him wanted to listen to her, to turn the truck around and get off this godforsaken road. But he thought of his delivery, his deadline. He couldn't afford to turn back now. "Look, lady, I got somewhere I need to be. Are you coming or not?" he said, trying to sound braver than he felt. The woman shook her head slowly, her hair swaying like shadows in the night. Then, "God help you," she murmured, stepping back into the fog and vanishing from sight. Joe sat there, staring at the empty road ahead. The urge to turn around was overwhelming, but he shoved it down. He was being ridiculous. There was no reason to be spooked by some strange woman. So, he put the truck back in gear, took a deep breath, and continued down Route 69. For a while, nothing happened. He tried to shake off the encounter, focusing on the road, but an uneasy feeling lingered. The mist thickened, wrapping around his truck until it felt like he was driving through a tunnel of fog. He could barely see past his headlights, and he had to slow down, gripping the wheel as his heart pounded. Then, he saw something else. A shadow on the side of the road. Another figure, this one hunched over as if crawling. Joe's stomach twisted, but he couldn't look away. The figure turned its head, and he caught a glimpse of sunken eyes and a mouth twisted into an unnatural smile. It watched him as he passed, the grin widening until it was nothing but a jagged slash across its face. Joe's breath came in short gasps. He tried to tell himself he was seeing things, that he was just tired, that it was all in his head. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there in the fog, something that was watching him. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. Joe couldn't tell anymore. Time seemed to stretch, the road endless. The radio flickered to life, but the music was distorted, warped voices and whispers filling the cab. He tried turning it off, but the voices persisted, growing louder, more urgent, almost pleading. Turn back, before it's too late. His hands shook as he clutched the steering wheel, his eyes darting from side to side, searching the fog for any sign of life, any hint of an escape. But the road just kept stretching on, with no end in sight. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A pair of headlights, faint at first, but growing brighter as they approached. Relief flooded him. Another truck. Maybe he wasn't alone out here after all. He flashed his lights, signaling the other driver, but the headlights didn't respond. They just kept coming, faster and faster, barreling straight toward him. Joe swerved, trying to get out of the way, but the other truck stayed on course, heading directly for him. In the last seconds, Joe braced for impact, squeezing his eyes shut, but there was no crash. The headlights passed right through him, as if they were made of smoke. When he opened his eyes, the road was empty again. The truck gone as if it had never been there to be. Why now? Joe was shaking, his nerves frayed. He had no idea how much further he had to go, but he knew one thing for sure. He needed to get off Route 69. He pressed down on the accelerator, speeding through the mist, praying he'd find a way out. But no matter how fast he drove, the road stretched on, twisting and turning in unnatural ways. The whispers grew louder, filling the cab until they were a deafening roar. Then, he saw it again, the woman from before, standing on the side of the road, her eyes wide with terror. She raised her hand, pointing to something behind him. Joe glanced in the mirror, and his blood ran cold. There, in the mist, was a shadow, darker than the night, a massive figure with glowing red eyes. It moved with impossible speed, closing the distance between them in seconds. Panicking, Joe floored the gas, his truck roaring as he tried to outrun the thing chasing him. But it was no use. The shadow kept pace, its eyes boring into him, filling him with a dread so deep he could hardly breathe. The radio crackled again, the distorted voices screaming, "Turn back! Turn back!" Joe's hands trembled, his vision blurring as he fought to keep control of the truck. He didn't know what this thing was, but he knew it wasn't human. It was something ancient, something evil, and it was coming for him. Suddenly, the road ahead seemed to shift, bending and twisting as if it were alive. Joe felt the truck lurch, the wheels skidding as he struggled to stay on course. The fog thickened, swallowing the road, until he was completely surrounded, lost in a sea of gray. And then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The fog lifted, the road straightened out, and Joe found himself on the outskirts of a small town. His hands were still clenched around the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had happened. But the shadow was gone, the whispers had stopped, and Route 69 lay behind him, silent and empty. Joe pulled into a diner, parking the truck and stumbling out, his legs weak. He needed a moment to catch his breath, to convince himself that what he'd seen hadn't been real. Inside the diner, a few locals sat at the counter, sipping coffee and chatting. Joe slid onto a stool, ordered a coffee, and tried to steady his nerves. The waitress noticed his shaking hands and gave him a sympathetic look. "Rough night on the road?" Joe nodded, barely able to speak. "You came off Route 69, didn't you?" she asked. Her voice low, he looked up, meeting her gaze. There was a knowing glint in her eyes, a look that told him she